The mountain wind screamed like a banshee, tearing at the lone figure clinging to the sheer cliff face. Below her, a yawning chasm of darkness promised instant death. Above, the monolithic structure of the enemy radar tower, codenamed Goliath, blotted out the stars. Captain Eva Rostova pressed her body against the freezing rock, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The storm that had masked her helicopter's insertion now threatened to pluck her from the mountain and dash her into the void. Her gloves were slick with ice melt, each grip a prayer. She was completely alone. This was the impossible mission. Goliath was not just a tower. It was a technological fortress, its advanced arrays rendering entire Allied air corridors useless. It had to fall. And Ava, a ghost in the U.S. Air Force's arsenal, was the only scalpel precise enough for the operation. Her file, locked in a vault at Langley, listed her as a communications and electronic warfare officer. The reality was far more specialized. She was a high-altitude infiltration specialist, a master of silent entry and catastrophic exit. She reached a small ledge, pausing to regulate her breathing. The memory of the briefing flashed in her mind. The general's stern face, the maps covered in red threat markers. "They think it's impregnable from the ground, Captain. They're wrong. You will prove them wrong." The weight of those words was heavier than the 80-pound pack on her back. Inside that pack were enough shaped charges to turn Goliath's electronic heart into molten slag. Her night vision goggles cast the world in a ghostly green hue. She scanned the tower's skeletal frame above. 2 guards patrolled a gantry, their silhouettes dark against the faint glow of interior lights. They were complacent, bored. Who would be mad enough to climb this devil's pinnacle in a storm? Eva Rostova, that's who. She unclipped her custom, integrally suppressed pistol. The climb was over. The hunt had begun. With the grace of a spider, she transitioned from the natural rock to the cold, wet steel of the service ladder. It vibrated faintly with the hum of the powerful machinery within. Every rung was a potential alarm, every footstep a potential echo. She moved with a painful slowness that defied the clock ticking down in her head. Her exfil helicopter, Viking, was holding station miles away, a speck of vulnerability in the hostile sky. They had 1 hour. The window was closing. She reached the maintenance hatch, a heavy, sealed door that was supposed to be accessible only from the inside. This was her entry point. From a waterproof pouch on her vest, she retrieved a device no larger than a credit card. She pressed it against the electronic lock. A tiny screen on the device lit up, running through a rapid series of algorithms. A soft click, barely audible over the wind, signaled success. Ava allowed herself a thin, cold smile. She was in. She slipped inside the tower, the world of howling wind suddenly replaced by the deafening, steady hum of servers and cooling fans. It was warm, almost uncomfortably so. She was in the tower's guts, a narrow service corridor packed with wires and conduits. This was her domain. This was where she would kill the giant. She shed her heavy climbing pack, moving with a new, lethal purpose. The shaped charges came out, blocks of high explosives molded to focus their destructive force. She placed the first charge on the primary power coupling, a thick trunk of cables that pulsed with energy. She placed the second on the main processing unit, the tower's electronic brain. The mission was proceeding with textbook perfection. But in war, the textbook is often the first thing thrown out the window. A metallic clang echoed from a level below. Then another. Footsteps. Heavy, booted footsteps coming up the internal staircase. They were not on the patrol schedule. Ava froze, flattening herself behind a rack of servers. She held her breath, her pistol raised. The footsteps grew louder, accompanied by the casual murmur of voices. They stopped just on the other side of the server bank. One of them lit a cigarette. The smell of tobacco filled the air. Eva calculated her odds. 2 targets. Close quarters. She could take them, but the noise, even suppressed, might be heard. Her mission was sabotage, not assault. She willed herself to become part of the machinery, a shadow in the machine. The moment stretched, taut as a wire. Then the footsteps moved on, descending back down the stairs. The immediate danger had passed. She released a breath she didn't realize she was holding. The charges were set. It was time to leave. It was time to vanish. But the mountain and the enemy had other plans. the memory of her father's hands, stained with engine grease and trembling with a fear she was too young to understand, flashed before her eyes as she rechecked the primer cord on the final charge. It was a bizarre, unwelcome intrusion. Colonel Alexei Rostov, the brilliant Soviet radar engineer who had risked everything to defect to the West, had never wanted this life for his only daughter. He had shown her how to rewire a radio, not a demolition circuit. He had taught her chess, not close-quarters combat. Yet here she was, deep inside the belly of a beast, just like the ones he had helped build, preparing to tear it apart. It was his legacy that had put her on this cliff, his genius that made her the only person who truly understood the tower's single, critical weakness. She pushed the thought away, locking it down deep. Sentiment was a luxury a ghost could not afford. The charges were set. A 5-minute timer, synced to her exfil window, was now active. A cold, professional calm settled over her. She had done this 100 times in simulation. This was just one more. She moved back to the service hatch, her movements economical and precise. The howling wind welcomed her back with an icy blast. She reattached her rappel line, giving it a firm, practiced tug. The exfil point was a narrow ledge 800 feet below, where Viking would be waiting, rotors turning, for exactly 47 seconds. She began her descent. The controlled zip of the rope through her descender, a reassuring sound. The storm was her ally now, its gusts masking any noise. For 30 seconds it was perfect. Then, a new sound sliced through the gale, the deep, rhythmic thump, thump, thump of rotor blades. It wasn't Viking. Her blood ran cold. An enemy Mi-17 helicopter, a dark, angular shape against the clouds, emerged from behind a neighboring peak. Its searchlight, a blinding white spear, began a systematic sweep of the mountain face. Viking, this is Nightingale. I have an unscheduled visual. On Mi-17 orbiting the target area. Her voice was a low, controlled whisper into her throat mic. The response was crackled with static. Nightingale, Viking. We see it. Abort descent. Hold position and go dark. Go dark. Become a rock. She stopped her rappel, swinging gently against the cliff. She pressed herself into a fissure, making her silhouette as small as possible. The searchlight swept closer, illuminating the rocks just 50 feet to her left. She held her breath. The light passed over her position, and for a heart-stopping second she was bathed in its blinding glare. Had it paused? She couldn't tell. Then it moved on, continuing its methodical search. She let out a shuddering breath. The relief was short-lived. The Mi-17, instead of moving away, turned and began a second tighter pass. The pilot was thorough. This time the light found her. It pinned her against the rock like a butterfly on a display board. A loud, distorted voice boomed from the helicopter's loudspeaker in a language she understood perfectly. "Halt! Identify yourself!" There was no more stealth. There was only the clock. Her 5-minute timer was down to 90 seconds. If she didn't move now, Viking would be forced to leave, and she would be trapped on the mountain, surrounded. "Viking, I'm compromised," she said, her voice now tight with urgency. "I am initiating detonation. Negative, Nightingale." "Wait for the—" She didn't hear the rest. The Mi-17's door gunner opened up. Tracer rounds ripped through the night, chewing the cliff face to pulverized stone just feet from her head. The sound was deafening, an industrial roar that drowned out all thought. She had one choice left. Go down with the tower or go down trying. She released her brake and dropped. It was a free fall for a terrifying second before she re-engaged the descender, sliding down the rope at a reckless, burning speed. The wind tore at her. The gunner tracked her descent, the line of fire chasing her down the rock face. She looked up, her thumb finding the detonator switch on her vest. With the enemy spotlight still illuminating her, with rounds sparking off the rock around her, she pressed it. The world ended in fire and sound. The entire top of the radar tower vanished, replaced by a silent, expanding orange ball that for a moment seemed to swallow the storm itself. Then the shockwave hit her. It was a physical wall of compressed air that slammed into her, smashing her against the unforgiving rock. The rope went slack. The searing heat washed over her. The last thing she felt was a sickening crack in her leg. The last thing she saw was the earth rushing up to meet her. The last thing she heard was the ghost of her own name lost in the static. The first sensation was a cold so profound it felt like a burn. Then came the pain, a white-hot fire erupting from her right leg, pulsing in time with her heartbeat. Eva Rostova opened her eyes to a world of gray rock and black sky. The acrid smell of explosives and burnt wiring filled the air, a thick, choking haze. She was lying on a narrow, debris-strewn ledge. Above her, the skeleton of the radar tower glowed a dull, angry red, its twisted metal groaning in the wind. The Me-17 was gone, either destroyed in the blast or driven away. She tried to move, and a strangled cry escaped her lips. Her right leg was bent at a nauseating angle just below the knee. The bone was not protruding, but the agony was absolute. Survival training took over, a cold, logical script running in her mind past the screaming pain. Assess, secure, move. Her fingers, clumsy with cold, fumbled at the medical kit on her belt. She injected herself with a morphine auto-injector, the sharp prick a welcome distraction. The fire in her leg dulled to a heavy throbbing ache. Her comms were dead. A spiderweb of cracks covered the screen of her tactical tablet. She was alone and cut off. She used her knife to cut a length of webbing from her damaged rappel line, fashioning a crude but effective splint around her leg. Every movement was a monumental effort, sending fresh waves of nausea crashing over her. She had to get off this ledge. The explosion would have drawn every enemy patrol for 20 miles. She began to crawl. It was a slow, agonizing process of pulling herself forward with her arms, dragging her useless leg behind her. The storm, which had been her enemy, was now her only ally, its relentless wind and stinging snow erasing her trail and masking the sound of her movement. She had no destination, only a direction, west, towards the distant and uncertain safety of the border, 60 miles away through some of the most unforgiving terrain on Earth. Hours bled into one another. The morphine wore off, and the pain returned with a vengeance, a sharp, grinding sensation with every inch she gained. She found a shallow cave, little more than a scrape in the rock, and dragged herself into it. Shivering uncontrollably, she forced herself to eat a high-calorie nutrition bar, chewing slowly despite having no saliva. Her water was low. She pulled the faded photograph from her vest. It was of her and her father, taken on a rare trip to the beach. He was smiling, his arm around her, the worries of his old life seemingly forgotten. She had promised him she would be careful. A single hot tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek before she angrily wiped it away. Dawn was a gray, miserable affair. The snow had stopped, but a thick fog had rolled in, reducing visibility to a few feet. Using the fog as a blanket, she used a rock to tighten the splint on her leg, biting down on a piece of leather from her glove to keep from screaming. She had to find water. Remembering her survival training, she listened for the faintest trickle of sound. There to her left. A thin stream of meltwater was running down a rock face. She filled her canteen and dropped in a purification tablet, the faint fizz a sound of profound hope. It was then she heard them. Voices, guttural, speaking in the local dialect. A patrol. They were close, maybe 30 yards away, moving parallel to the cliff base. She flattened herself against the wet rock, becoming just another shadow in the fog. Her pistol was in her hand, the cold metal a familiar comfort. She had 7 rounds. If they found her, she would make them count. The voices grew louder. A man laughed. They were so close she could smell the stale tobacco on their clothes. She held her breath, her finger resting lightly on the trigger. One of them paused, seeming to look directly into her hiding spot. The world narrowed to the space between his eyes. Then he coughed, spat, and moved on. The sounds of the patrol faded into the fog. Eva released a shuddering breath, the tension draining from her body and leaving her weak and trembling. She had survived the night, but the long walk home had only just begun. The silence after the patrol passed was more terrifying than their presence. Every rustle of wind, every pebble dislodged by a mountain goat, sounded like an enemy footstep to Eva's strained nerves. The fog clung to her, a wet, cold shroud that seeped through her fatigues and into her bones. The morphine had long since worn off, leaving the broken bone in her leg as a throbbing center of agony that colored her entire world. She had to move. Staying still was to accept death. She began a slow, torturous crawl away from the stream, knowing the patrol might double back. Each movement was a calculated act of will. She would drag her body forward a few feet with her elbows, biting down on a scream as her leg jostled against the ground. Then she would stop and listen, her ears straining against the oppressive quiet. Progress was measured in inches. Her world shrank to the next rock, the next patch of gravel. The grand mission was gone. The geopolitical stakes meant nothing. Her only objective was to survive the next 5 minutes. Hours bled together. The gray light of day did little to warm her. She found a small overhang that offered a sliver of protection from the wind. Her canteen was half empty. The 2 nutrition bars in her pocket were gone. Hunger was a sharp, gnawing presence in her gut. She thought of the hot meals in the mess hall, the bitter coffee, the simple, unremarkable act of sitting in a chair. Those memories felt like they belonged to another person, in another lifetime. A sound cut through her misery, distinct and close. Not voices this time, but the soft clinking of metal on rock. She froze, her hand going to her pistol. It came again, closer. Peering through the fog, she saw a shape materialize. A goat, a shaggy mountain animal with curved horns, picking its way along a narrow path she hadn't even seen. It stopped and looked at her with indifferent, ancient eyes before moving on, disappearing back into the mist. The path. Where the goat could go, she could follow. It was a thread of hope. Using her good leg and her arms, she pulled herself toward the narrow track. It was a treacherous, sloping ledge, but it was a path, and it led downward away from the high cliffs. The journey was excruciating. Several times, loose stones gave way under her weight, and she only just stopped herself from sliding over the edge. Her gloves were torn, her fingers raw and bleeding. As evening began to paint the fog with shades of purple, she saw it. A small, abandoned shepherd's hut, built into the side of the mountain. It was little more than 4 stone walls and a collapsed roof, but it was shelter. It was a destination. Summoning the last of her strength, she dragged herself across the final 50 yards and through the low, broken doorway. Inside, it was dark and smelled of dirt and old animal droppings. But it was dry. It was the first truly dry place she had been in since the tower. She collapsed against a wall, her body trembling with exhaustion and pain. For a long time, she just sat there, breathing in the stale, still air. She allowed herself to believe, for just a moment, that she might actually make it. She checked her pistol. 6 rounds left. She had 1 canteen of water and no food. But she had shelter. She had survived another day. As darkness fell completely, she curled into a ball in the driest corner, clutching the empty pistol in one hand and her father's photograph in the other, and fell into a fitful, haunted sleep. The nightmares were of falling and of a searchlight that always found her. A sharp crack of pain jerked Eva from her shallow, nightmare-ridden sleep. Her leg had stiffened into an angry, useless log during the night. The inside of the hut was pitch black. The only sound, the relentless whisper of the wind outside. She fumbled for her canteen, her thirst overwhelming. She took a single measured sip, swishing it around her dry mouth before swallowing. It was a discipline born of desperation. This water had to last. Dawn was a slow, gray invasion. Light seeped through the cracks in the stone walls, revealing the hut's bleak interior. It was empty save for a few scraps of rotten wood and a pile of dry leaves in one corner. Then her eyes, trained to notice everything, caught a glimpse of color amidst the brown and gray. Tucked into a crevice in the wall, as if placed there deliberately, was a small, weathered box. Her training screamed trap, IED, sensor, but a deeper, more human instinct pulled at her. Using the barrel of her pistol, she carefully pried the box loose. It was simple, wooden, and light. She held her breath and slowly lifted the lid. There was no explosion, no poison dart. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded cloth, was a single, pristine brass cartridge, a 7.62mm round. Next to it lay a small hand-stitched doll, its features faded but its dress a traditional, colorful pattern. It was a votive offering, a plea for protection or perhaps a memorial. This hut wasn't just a shelter. It was a shrine, a place where someone had grieved for a lost son. a lost husband. The weight of the round in her palm felt immense. It was a symbol of the very conflict she was a part of, the human cost on both sides that was so easily forgotten in a briefing room. The moment of reflection shattered. The distant, unmistakable thrum of a helicopter echoed through the valley. Not the heavy beat of the Mi-17, but the distinct, sharper sound of a little bird. An American helicopter. Her heart leaped into her throat. Had they come for her? She dragged herself to the doorway, peering out through a crack in the stones. The fog had lifted, revealing a clear, cold morning. The helicopter was a speck in the distance, moving fast and low, following a different valley. It wasn't searching. It was on another mission. It flew on, and the sound of its rotors faded, leaving a silence that felt heavier than before. The hope that had flared so brightly extinguished itself, leaving her feeling more alone than ever. They thought she was dead. Of course they did. Viking had seen the tower explode, seen her fall. Her file had likely already been stamped, KIA. The realization was a colder chill than the mountain air. No one was coming. Her survival was now entirely her own responsibility. She looked at the brass cartridge in her hand, then at her pistol. 6 rounds. She placed the cartridge carefully back in the box and closed the lid, a silent thank you to the unknown family who had left it. That single round was more valuable than any medal. It was a reminder of what she was fighting to get back to. A life. A new resolve, hard and sharp, settled within her. She would not die in this hut. She would not become a ghost. Using a piece of fallen timber as a crude crutch, she pushed herself upright, biting back a scream as fire shot up her leg. She tested her weight. It was agony, but she could stand. Leaning heavily on the timber, she took a lurching step forward, then another. She moved out of the hut and back onto the goat path, her body screaming in protest with every hobbling step. She was no longer crawling. She was walking. The path descended steeply into a thick pine forest. The trees offered cover, a promise of concealment she hadn't had on the exposed cliffs. She didn't look back at the hut. Her eyes were fixed ahead, on the dark, welcoming line of the trees. She had a very long way to go. The pine forest was a different world. The screaming wind was now a muffled sigh high in the branches. The biting cold became a damp, earthy chill that seeped into her bones. For Eva, the crutch was both a savior and a torment. Each lurching step sent a jolt of white-hot pain from her leg through her entire body. She focused on the rhythm. Step, drag, breathe, step, drag, breathe. The forest floor was a soft mattress of fallen needles, a small mercy that muffled her clumsy progress. Her thirst was a raging fire in her throat. Her canteen was empty. She scanned the terrain, her eyes trained for enemy movement, now searching for survival. She found a patch of clean, late-season snow nestled in the roots of a giant pine. She scooped handfuls into her mouth, the meltwater so cold it made her teeth ache, but it was life itself. She filled her canteen with snow, knowing it would provide precious water later. Hunger was a more cunning enemy. It gnawed at her concentration, making her lightheaded. She saw a cluster of dark green leaves she recognized from survival school. Sorrel. She ripped a handful and chewed, the sharp, lemony taste a shocking burst of flavor. It wasn't much, but it was something. She found a few pine nuts in a cone, painstakingly extracting them with shaking fingers. Each tiny morsel was a victory. The forest began to play tricks on her. In the dappled shadows, she saw figures moving. She heard voices whispering her name. She knew it was the dehydration and exhaustion, the early stages of hypothermia, but the hallucinations felt utterly real. She saw her father, not as he was in the photograph, but as he was on his deathbed, his hand frail in hers. "Be careful, my Eva," the phantom whispered. She shook her head violently, blinking the vision away. "I'm trying, Papa," she mumbled to the empty woods, her voice a dry croak. A sudden, sharp crack echoed through the trees. Not a branch underfoot, a gunshot. Distant, but unmistakable. Then another. The hunt was still on. They were searching the lower valleys. The sound acted like a shot of adrenaline, clearing the fog from her mind. She pushed forward with renewed, desperate energy, using the trees to pull herself along, her crutch digging painfully into her armpit. She reached a small, fast-flowing stream, its water clear and icy. This was a decision point. Follow the water downstream? It was the logical path, likely leading to a village, but also to people. People who might be friendly or who might be the enemy. Or she could cross it, continue west through the trackless forest. As she stood at the water's edge, paralyzed by indecision, a glint of metal on the far bank caught her eye. It was half buried in the mud. A spent shell casing, then another. And a few feet away, a torn, muddy piece of fabric from a U.S. military-issue uniform. This wasn't just a path. It was a trail. Someone else had come this way, someone running. A pilot who had ejected? A member of a failed patrol? They had chosen to cross. It was a sign. She had to believe it was a sign. Steeling herself, she stepped into the water. The cold was so intense it stole her breath. The current tugged at her, threatening to pull her crutch from her grasp and sweep her off her feet. She fought for every step, her teeth chattering uncontrollably. The water climbed to her waist, soaking her fatigues, adding a terrible, dragging weight. The far bank seemed a mile away. Her legs screamed in protest, the cold water seeping into the splint, a new dimension of agony. But she kept moving, one agonizing step at a time, her eyes locked on the opposite shore, on the hope that she was following a trail left by a fellow ghost trying to find its way home. The far bank was a slippery wall of mud. Ava clawed at it with her raw, frozen fingers, her crutch lost to the stream's relentless pull. She hauled her body out of the water, collapsing onto the wet earth like a drowned animal. She lay there, shivering violently, the weight of her soaked clothes threatening to pin her to the ground. The cold was no longer a sensation. It was a state of being. It had sunk deep into her marrow. She knew, with a clinical certainty that cut through the haze of pain, that if she did not get dry, she would be dead in a few hours. Summoning a reserve of strength she did not know she possessed, she pushed herself up. She had to move. Movement was heat. She stripped off her soaked outer tactical vest and her camouflage shirt, wringing the icy water from them before putting the freezing fabric back on her skin. It was a special kind of torture. Using a low-hanging pine branch as a new, clumsy crutch, she forced her body into a stumbling jog. It was less a run and more a series of frantic falling steps, but it made her blood pump. Her lungs burned. Her leg was a torch of pain. But slowly, a faint, prickling warmth began to return to her core. She followed the trail of clues left by the unknown soldier who had come before her. Another shell casing. A footprint in a patch of soft mud. They were small, fragile breadcrumbs of hope in an immense wilderness. The forest began to thin, the trees giving way to rocky, open ground. And then she saw it. Through a gap in the trees, perhaps 5 miles distant, nestled in a high valley, was a small collection of buildings. A village. It was the first sign of permanent human habitation she had seen. Her heart soared, then immediately plummeted. Was it friendly? Was it hostile? There was no way to know. She found a vantage point behind a large boulder and slumped down, pulling a small monocular from a sealed pouch on her belt. It was still functional. She scanned the village. It looked poor, quiet. A few goats, a single dusty vehicle. No obvious military presence. But then her eye caught something on the outskirts. A radio antenna, cleverly disguised to look like a dead tree. And next to it, a low, sand-colored building that didn't look like a home. It had the sterile, functional look of a military outpost. Her breadcrumbs had led her not to salvation, but to the lion's den. Despair washed over her, so complete it felt like a physical blow. She had come so far. She had endured so much. To be this close only to be trapped. She looked at her pistol. 5 rounds left. She would not be taken alive. She would not be used as a propaganda tool. She would make them pay. As she formulated her final, desperate plan, a new sound made her flinch. Not a helicopter, not gunfire. A low mechanical drone high above. She tilted her head back, scanning the clear blue sky. There, a tiny silver speck, leaving a faint white contrail. A Global Hawk drone. An American reconnaissance drone? It was miles high, an unblinking eye in the sky on a routine mapping mission, utterly unaware of her existence. But she was aware of it. And it represented a protocol, a system she was a part of. If that drone was here, there was a task force, a command center, someone watching its feed. They were looking for something. Maybe they were even looking for her. She had to send a signal. A signal they would understand, but the enemy in the outpost would not. Her eyes fell on a patch of flat, sandy ground between her and the tree line. It was a risk, a terrible risk, but it was her only one. Ignoring the screaming pain in her leg, she began to gather stones. She worked with frantic, focused energy, arranging them not randomly, but in a specific, pre-briefed pattern, a circle with a line through it, a universal symbol for friendly. And next to it, using smaller stones, she spelled out 2 letters. Her call sign, NR Nightingale. It was a message in a bottle, thrown into the vast ocean of the sky, a prayer that the right person would be looking down at the right time. She finished and collapsed behind the boulder, utterly spent. She had done all she could. The rest was in the hands of the ghosts who watched from the clouds. The sun dipped below the peaks, casting long, cold shadows across the valley. Ava watched the village and the outpost from her hiding place, her body a single, throbbing ache. The drone was long gone, a forgotten speck in the vast sky. Had anyone seen her signal? It felt like a foolish, desperate act now, the scratchings of a doomed woman. Hopelessness began to wrap its cold fingers around her heart, tighter than the mountain chill. She checked her pistol for the 5th time. 4 rounds left. 1 for each of the enemy soldiers she might take with her, and the last one for herself. The final grim mathematics of a soldier who would not be captured. Then, a new sound, not from the village, but from the sky to the west. The faint, familiar thrum of helicopter rotors. Not 1, but 2. They were flying fast and low, skimming the terrain, their navigation lights off. Her breath caught in her throat. They were Black Hawks, and they were heading straight for her. A wild, impossible hope flared in her chest. She fumbled for the survival mirror in her kit, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold it. As the helicopters swooped into the valley, she angled the mirror, catching the last of the sunset and flashing it toward the lead aircraft. The response was immediate and violent. The 2 Black Hawks flared hard, one peeling off to hover protectively over her position, its minigun swiveling to cover the village and the outpost. The other descended into a cloud of dust and debris just 100 yards from her boulder. Figures clad in night camouflage and body armor leaped out, their weapons raised, forming a secure perimeter. They moved with a fluid, lethal precision that spoke of countless missions. One of the figures broke from the perimeter and ran straight toward her boulder. He slid to his knees beside her, his helmet and night vision goggles making him an anonymous, robotic angel of mercy. "Captain Rostova?" he yelled over the rotor wash. She could only manage a weak nod. He ripped open a medical kit. "Ma'am, we're Task Force 77. We're here to bring you home." The words were simple, but they were the most beautiful words she had ever heard. Home. He injected her with a powerful painkiller, the relief so sudden it made her dizzy. 2 other operators rushed over with a collapsible stretcher. They lifted her with practiced care, strapping her in securely. As they carried her at a run toward the waiting helicopter, she saw activity at the enemy outpost. Lights were coming on, figures were running. A single shot rang out, then was drowned by the overwhelming roar of the covering Black Hawk's minigun, which hosed the outpost's front with a torrent of fire that silenced all resistance. They loaded her into the dark, vibrating belly of the helicopter. The medic stayed with her, holding her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. "You're safe, Captain. You're safe now!" The helicopter lifted off, banking sharply and powerfully away from the mountain. Ava turned her head and looked out the open door. The village, the outpost, the entire Nightmare Valley shrunk away below her, becoming just another part of the dark, indifferent landscape. She was flying. She was free. Weeks later, on a crisp autumn morning in Washington, D.C., she stood at attention, her posture perfect despite the cane she leaned on. Her dress blues felt strange and formal. She was in a quiet, wood-paneled office deep within the Pentagon. Standing before her was the same 3-star general who had given her the mission. His stern face was softened by something that looked like profound respect. He did not give a speech. He simply looked her in the eye, his own glistening slightly. "Captain Rostova," he said, his voice low but clear. "The Goliath mission saved countless lives. It changed the strategic picture in the entire region. Your country can never know your name. They can never know what you did or the price you paid. He held up the medal, the Distinguished Service Medal, its ribbon a splash of color in the sober room. But we know. He pinned it to her chest, the weight of it feeling insignificant compared to the weight that had lifted from her soul. He then rendered a sharp, perfect salute. Ava, her back straight and her chin high, returned it. There were no cameras, no cheers, just the silent, enduring recognition of a soldier who had walked through fire and returned. The ghost had finally come home.